Hello friends, I welcome you all to this new video which is in the series of the videos on experimental research and experimental design. This video, which is the second video on the series of experimental research or experimental design, will be based on experimental threats or threats involved in experimental research. Whenever we are doing an experimental research, and we are trying to interpret the findings on the effectiveness of independent variable on dependent variables, we need to take care of different other variables working in between them. While interpreting the results, if we are not taking care of those other variables, indeed then we are committing some mistakes, are indeed then the threats of any experimental research. So in this particular video, we will be understanding what are the different threats involved in doing experimental research, and if they are not controlled or not taken care of, then how they become the threats of internal and external validity of the experimental research. So keep watching. Okay, while conducting an experimental research, there are many challenges related to conducting a research in education or experimental designs or experimental research. First, there is lack of sufficient exposure to treatments and failure to make the treatments substantially different from each other. So these two challenges we need to take care of. It is quite important that we as a researcher has a very clear understanding of our independent variable, its characteristics, how it has to be manipulated or used during the experimental treatment. Unless we have very specific understanding on the nature of our independent variable, it will be very challenging to do the research without any threats or biasness. We may be saying we are conducting an activity-based class in theory, whereas we might be practicing in real a cooperative learning situation or something different that does not match the theory or the idea of that particular variable or independent variable. It has to be also understood how much exposure is required for the treatment. As we can relate it to medicine, our doctors always prescribe to complete the full course of taking the pills provided, and we can only judge the effectiveness of those pills once we complete the entire course. Similarly, we have to be very much sure about the treatment that's provided in the experimental studies conducted in social science too. How many classes we need to take before analyzing the results. Thus, providing the proper definition of the independent variable is also important within a research study, so as to ensure the internal validity and external validity of the studies or replicability of the studies. I hope you all know what do we mean by internal and external validity of the findings. Anyhow, we will be understanding it in the latter part of this particular video presentation. So be with us. Well, we need to very well understand that for the success of any experimental research, it all depends upon how well we are able to control the study variables. This may be also termed as principle of control. Well, this control varies from maximizing the variance to minimizing the variance. We may take it like maximizing the systematic variance or desirable variance, controlling the extraneous systematic variance, which may influence the study findings, and then minimizing the error variance. Okay, we will see what are these particular different types of variances, and we will understand how controlling this systematic variance or error variance lead towards better result findings or for the validity of the study findings. Okay, it is quite true that in any experimental work, the researchers try to work on maximizing the variances of the variable. The investigator studies the maximum or the optimum possible differences in the outcome, that is, on the dependent variable caused by the treatment, that is due to the maximum or optimum changes in the independent variable, how it is going to affect the dependent variable. So if you are conducting experimental study through activity based lesson, you need to implement it fully, ensuring full exposure to the students so as to study its effectiveness on the dependent variable or on the achievement in science. This is what it means maximizing the systematic variance. I hope now you got the idea of what is the meaning of maximizing the systematic variance. In addition to this, researchers also need to remove or minimize the error or random variance due to different sources. For example, if he measures using faulty instruments, indeed he is going to commit many errors. For example, if the measurement instruments are not reliable, also the experimental process is not implemented in the manner it is conceptualized or as per the theory suggests, then indeed there is a problem and hence it should be taken care of. If the experimental design has been non implemented well, then again we are committing an error. So these all things has to be taken care of. If the conceptual idea of the treatment variable has been taken care of, if the design has been implemented nicely or theory suggests, it will automatically reduce the errors in the findings and make sure the internal and external validity of the study. As we can see in the picture, if a tailor start measuring for your new dress using a faulty measuring tape, you all know what will be the outcome. You will definitely have a flabby dress. Similarly, in the experimental treatment or during experimentation, we need to control all the systematic variances like error due to unreliable instrument or due to the systematic or unsystematic way of conducting the research. And these all can only thus result in maximizing the validity and reliability of the findings, or we can say the internal and external validity of the study findings. Okay, now it is also the fact that the investigator or the researcher has to minimize the error variances which may confound the study findings in various ways. They have to be controlled so that the causal relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable may be smoothly established. All the confounding factors like the noisy environment, a problematic child in the classroom, etc., needs to be controlled so as to strengthen the validity of the findings. Okay, now when we talk about controlling the confounding factors or intervening extraneous variables, there are several ways to control it. Let us see some examples of how to control them. One of the process is matching. What is matching process? Well, when we match both the group based on certain set of criteria which are likely to influence the study is called as matching or one-to-one matching. The variables on which we can match the groups are some relevant variables which seems logical in relation to the study variables, that is independent or dependent variable, or seems to influence the experiment and its outcome, like IQ, age, gender, etc. are the examples of these variables. Through this, we achieve the target that both the groups have similar group composition before the experiment. For example, if both the group differ in their IQ before the independent variables start acting, then it is obvious that the changes observed in the group outcomes cannot be directly associated due to the independent variables or due to the treatment. Hence, matching can help us in this regard. Randomization is another process of controlling the extraneous variable. Here, the participants are assigned to experimental and control groups randomly, and thus controlling any biasness in this study. Randomization keeps the probability that the subjects have equal probability of getting selected in either of the groups, and thus the control is self-imposed that both or more groups are equals, as we have not given any preferential treatment to the subjects while allotting them to the groups. And another method of control is through eliminating the variables. Those may influence the study finding. Suppose we are bothered about sex or gender related differences existing in the composition of the group. Then we may include only one gender in the study and thus eliminate the other gender. That means we can make the group only including boys, or we can make the groups only composing of the girls. Thus, it is also in a way to increase the validity and replicability of the study. Well, we can also statistically equate the groups using ANCOVA or analysis of covariance technique. ANCOVA or analysis of covariance technique is used to statistically equate the two groups at the initial level such that the differences observed in the dependent variable is only due to independent variable and not due to the group differences existing before the study. For example, suppose we are worried about some differences existing in the groups at pre-experimental level. So how to manage it? So here pre-experimental test score can be taken as a covariant and thus managing the initial differences and observe the changes happening in the post-test scores of the groups after the treatment and thus measuring the significant changes in the dependent variable scores and interpreting accordingly. In another way, suppose that some unique characteristics existing within the group and is very much detrimental to the study findings. Then how to manage that? Here suppose we are worried about the gender influences, that is different gender students in the groups. Then how to manage it? Then we can take it as a moderator variable and further by taking the two-way ANCOVA technique within the group, we can just do the study and justify the findings. So these all are few techniques of controlling the confounding factors or intervening extraneous variable. Now, before going further, let us first try to understand two very important terms in relation to an experimental study. First is the internal validity and the second is the external validity. Let us understand them one by one. Internal validity of an experimental research is the extent of assurance of that the effect observed in the dependent variable is only due to the treatment or caused by the independent variable. For example, if we are studying the effectiveness of particular instructional methods, say for example activity-based learning, on the achievement in science, the significant change which we observe in the achievement scores has to be only due to the experimental treatment and not due to some other factors like students attending coaching classes or due to the presence of high IQ students in the experimental group, etc. So that our research procedural validity holds and we are sure about its internal validity. The second validity is very easy to understand, that is external validity. External validity talks about the extent by which the study findings can be generalized to different settings, which we also know as ecological validity, and to different set of audience, which is also known as population validity. Thus, it talks about how much the experimental research findings can be replicated, or we can say that what is the scope of the study. Now, let us talk about different threats in experimental research or design. The first among these is history. The events and the incidences happening during the experimental period may affect the natural response of the experimental group or the control group. Thus, it may challenge the internal validity of the research. Suppose while studying the effect of counseling sessions on the job satisfaction of the teachers, it may happen that during the training session, if there is a government announcement of salary hike, then it may really create a doubt on the effectiveness of the counseling sessions. Similarly, if there is an announcement of pay cut, there may be also an alteration in the study findings. Thus, it poses a threat to the internal validity of the findings and needs to be addressed while conducting the study. Maturation is another factor which work as a threat and have adverse effect on the study findings. Changes occurring in the participants with passage of time, like getting tired, getting more wiser, bored, more experience during the study affects the sensitivity of the study and poses a threat to the experimental work or experimental findings. Suppose with the continuous exposure of treatment of the experimental group, it may lead them to tiredness and thus the natural outcomes may not be observed. Similarly, continuous exposure to the treatment may lead you to become more experienced or wiser on the study variables, and then it may lead you to higher gain scores, but it may not last for longer duration or they may not sustain. So this type of things needs to be taken care of and addressed wisely for the better outcome or reliability or the validity of the findings. Testing or pre-testing the groups on the dependent variable before the study begins always has the threat that the results on the actual test after the treatment may be altered and natural outcome may not get reflected and causal relationship may lack validity and should be taken care of. For example, suppose we are seeing the effectiveness of teaching method on the achievement of a subject. The pre-testing may sensitize the group or groups to behave in some other way in contrast to their natural behavior. That is, as they have already know the achievement test scores, achievement test content and nature, so it may make them more wiser and it may make them more sensitive to the test conducted after the treatment, and thus it may lead them to gain higher scores and naturally it is a threat to the study outcomes. Again, the testing instruments or instrumentation may not be scored similarly. Perhaps the person grading the post-test is fatigued and pays less attention to the last set of papers reviewed, which is indeed a challenge to experimenters. The fallacy of the measurement devices, tools, and techniques poses threats to the study. If the tool lacks validity, it is for sure that the study internal validity cannot be established. Of course, we may understand if we say that we are measuring creativity, we should be doing that with our tool and should not be measuring some other attributes like intelligence, personality, or achievement. Again, suppose our tool has not a true zero value or the scales reading is not at all visible, or if it is a digital device, the battery becomes weak and reflecting wrong measures. So these all are threats to experimental research. So this type of instrumentation defects poses real challenge while conducting experimental studies and need to be taken care of while conducting the study. Another threat to internal validity is statistical regression. Statistical regression is also a threat to the internal validity of study, as it is well established fact that extreme scores both towards higher or towards the lower end tends to regress towards the mean, and it is very much true for the human attributes like height, intelligence, weight, mass, etc. Thus, we need to be very careful with interpreting the post-test results. Let us see an example. An individual with extreme tall height, it is quite obvious that he will be having a comparatively shorter height child, and similarly, an extremely short-heighted person will be having a comparatively taller child. Thus, the increase and decrease in the extreme pretest scores may be also only due to statistical regression and not due to the actual treatment or due to the manipulation of the independent variable, and then it must be taken care of while interpreting the study findings or while establishing the causal relationship between independent and their dependent variable. Another threat to internal validity is the differential selection of the participants in both the groups, and it poses threats to the study findings. Participants in the experimental and control groups have different characteristics, and thus they behave differently to the treatment as well as perform differently on the dependent variable. These group differences may be deliberate or unintentional and has to be checked too. If a researcher does not take care of these differences, then it may pose a threat to the internal validity of the study. Let us see another potential threats to internal validity. Mortality or subject mortality. This is also a threat to internal validity, and let us understand it. It may happen that the number of participants in the treatment may vary during the exposure period. They may attend some classes and may remain absent in several incidences. So exposure to the treatment is not equal to all the participants. Some may attend classes for 2 weeks and some for 10 days only. Similarly, the participants may vary or are different in those coming for the pre-tests or those attending the classes and those appeared for the post-test, and thus the study findings will lack validity. Hence, mortality is a challenge for the research. Another important threat to internal validity is Hawthrone effect, which is named after analyzing the studies done by Hawthrone. Let us understand it. The subject in the study may only react differently once they are aware that they are being studied or observed and not due to the experimental treatment. This is termed as Hawthrone effect. It has a story behind it. There was a classical research based on this, where the researcher wanted to see if the light intensity increases the productivity of the worker in the factory. It was seen as the intensity of the light increased, the productivity of the workers increased. When the researchers did the reverse analysis of the study by decreasing the intensity of the light, it was observed again that the productivity still goes on increasing, and thus it was concluded that it was not due to the intensity or due to increasing the light, but the mere fact that they are under observation. So it was not due to the increasing the light intensity, but as they are aware that they are being observed, the productivity increased. Thus, this effect also must be taken into consideration while interpreting the findings. It may be that only as experimental group observing that something novel practice is going on them or taking place upon them, they start reacting or become more sensitive to that particular treatment and produce significant results. And thus, while interpreting causal and effect relationship, we have to take care of this particular effect. Now, in another way, the things may also take place, which is addressed as John Henry effect. Okay. It may be also seen that one of the group, basically the control group, take it and think that they are in competition to the other group. They are not selected for the experimental treatment, and thus it may happen that they might try harder or increases their efforts, which they would not be working or doing while in the normal condition. This is known as John Henry effect, from the very classical old story of a worker, John Henry, who tried to compete with a machine to show himself and for the fellow workers that they are not inferior to a new machine working on a railroad track laying project to safeguard the job interest of the workers. Here he tried more than normal so as to prove him or the workers that they are better than the machine. When the control group increases their normal efforts, then the observation on the dependent variable may not be a valid or reliable one. Sometimes the control group may feel discouraged due to the fact that they are being neglected or not receiving the treatment. It is also known as resentful demoralization of the control group. Due to this, the control group may start playing or working at lower level than the usual or normally and thus the results may be influenced and interpretation will be not valid. And this must be also checked. Sometimes we try to keep the experimental treatment confidential so as to avoid this sin or threat. Compensatory equalization of treatment is another threat to internal validity. Let us see that. It may be that the researcher may feel sad that the control group is not getting some treatment or some better treatment and give them some special treatment, which may sometimes also create a chance to alter the findings and interpretation. For example, suppose we want to study effect of ABL or activity based learning on students' attitude towards science. While observing that the control group is not getting attention, he may show the control group a science fiction movie, which may in turn influence the expected results, and thus the attitude of students towards science in control group may get enhanced. And due to this compensatory treatment, the behavior or the outcome on the dependent variable may get changed, which is definitely a challenge to internal validity. The process of manipulation or implementation of the study has to be very well understood. Otherwise, implementation itself is a threat to internal validity. Suppose we say that we are studying the effect of flipped learning on the students. The researcher has to prepare his instructional plan accordingly and implement it accurately and has to be taken care of. Otherwise, the study will not be a valid one. If he fails to plan the lessons as per theoretical and pedagogical understanding of the flipped learning, he will fail to implement it. And then the study fails to give a valid finding, and thus it is a threat to the study. Now I will be discussing few of the threats which are related to external validity. External validity, which we have already understood earlier, deals with the replicability strength of the study findings. How much the findings of the study can be used for future studies, as well as can be implemented to different settings and to different subjects. This is also to be understood that when we are not ensuring internal validity of the study, we cannot also make sure that the external validity of the study is there. So experimental work which lacks internal validity always poses the threat for its external validity. First of these threat is pre-testing sensitization. It may be there that because as per the treatment procedure and control groups involved during an experiment, and as in many experimental designs, the groups are tested before the experimental treatment begins, and thus the groups, especially the experimental group, has acted in different manner, and thus the findings obtained in the study will not be a valid one, or we can say when it will be applied in general settings where there is absence of any control group or any pre-testing involved, the expected results may not be visible, and thus the replication of the study is not possible, which in turn is a threat to external validity. Multiple treatment sensitization is another issue in determining the external validity of the experimentation. If a researcher were to apply several treatments, it is difficult to determine how well each of the treatments would work individually. For example, if we want to see effectiveness of activity-based method, now these activities can be done individually or also in groups. So it might be that only the combination of activity-based learning and group method of treatments is effective and not the variable we are interested for. That is ABL in our case. When participants receive more than one treatment, it may be also there that the prior treatment limit the effect of the current treatment, and thus exact effect can be misunderstood and may be not generalized. Or we can say that replication can be a problem here. It has to be understood that to determine the success and to increase the replicability of the study, the description of the experimental condition, variable, and treatment has to be very clear. If the researcher has not clearly or specifically defined the independent variable and also has not adequately described how he or she has conducted the study, it is difficult to determine whether the results are applicable to other setting or not. So explicit or clear definition or specification of the independent variable or variable under study and the settings has to be there so as to increase the replicability of the study findings. Selection treatment interaction is another threat to external validity. If the researcher has selected the participants using non-random process, or if the participants have voluntarily participated or as per their convenience participated in the study, then it is sure that the generalization ability of the study shall be affected and the findings cannot be generalized because they are biased or full of biased results. Thus, random selection of the subject has to be encouraged while forming the groups. Now again, it is also true that the specific characteristics of the researcher or experimenter might have caused different effect which may not be replicated in other settings. Specific characteristics of the researcher or the experimenter might have caused different effect which may not be replicated in other settings. As the researcher presents itself his own mastery and experience on the manipulation of the independent variable, etc., which may not be same as the other researcher or the practitioners, and thus it can be threat to external validity. These things has to be taken care of, and thus the experimenter must try that his personality and characteristics does not influence the treatment. Few of the reactive agents that we have studied in the internal threats or threats to internal validity are also threats to external validity. The fact that they or the subjects are being part of the study or not being a part of the experimental treatment affects the participants to behave in a way which is different from their normal behavior. Hawthrone and John Henry effect are examples of reactive responses of being in a study, which I have already discussed earlier in this video. Thus, the findings obtained due to these types of reactions may not be generalized in the normal settings. So in this video, we have discussed that how control is important for any experimental work, how maximizing the systematic variance in the independent and dependent variable, reducing or removing the error or instrumental errors, and also by minimizing the effect of confounding variables helps in establishing the causal relationship in the experimental research. We also learned few methods of controlling extraneous variables. Those are confounding the research findings. Further, we have discussed the concept of internal and external validity of an experimental study and also different types of threats for internal validity and threats for external validity. So one of the most important goals of research should be thus to controlling these threats. Choosing an experimental design helps in removing or controlling this type of threats. So in the next video, we will be seeing different types of experimental designs and how improving the design or strategically planning the different designs, we will be able to control different threats and thus in turn increase the internal and external validity of the study. I hope you have liked this video, so please press the like button and also subscribe to this channel and keep watching. Thank you.